My name is Julie, I am 38 years old, and I am a general practitioner in Marseille. My husband Paul and I have been married for 12 years. We have a stable, comfortable, almost predictable life. Paul is a good, caring, and loving man. We have 2 wonderful children, Lucas and Chloe, and a charming house in the quiet Rukersblank neighborhood. We are the ideal family in everyone's eyes. However, for some time, I have felt an inner emptiness. The routine of our daily life, as reassuring as it may be, is gradually suffocating me. I feel like an actress playing a monotonous role, repeated day after day without variation. As a doctor, I am constantly busy, but even my career, which I once found exciting, seems to be losing its luster. I can't help but wonder if this is what life will be like until the end. It was in this state of mind that I saw Éric again, an old high school boyfriend. He had come to my office for a consultation. Éric and I had an intense, passionate, but brief relationship during our youth. Our paths had separated when I chose to pursue medical studies, and he went to live abroad. Seeing him again after all these years brought back buried memories and emotions that I thought I had forgotten. Éric was now 45 years old, a mature man but still as attractive as ever. He had returned to Marseille after a difficult divorce and was looking to rebuild his life. We chatted briefly during his first consultation, exchanging pleasantries about our respective lives. Yet behind each word, I felt the old connection between us rekindle, like an ember waiting to ignite. After this first meeting, Éric returned for regular follow-ups. Each visit was a breath of fresh air, an escape from my routine. Our conversations became more and more personal, less and less professional. We started meeting outside of consultations, first for coffee, then for lunches, and finally for dinners. I knew I was playing with fire, but the excitement of these stolen moments was irresistible. I felt alive again, as if Éric was bringing to the surface a part of me that I had lost along the way. We talked about everything, about nothing, about our past dreams, our present desires. Each meeting was an enchanted parenthesis where I could be myself, far from expectations and responsibilities. With Paul, the emotional distance grew. I distanced myself mentally and physically. He noticed, of course, but he was too busy with his own work and our children to really worry. I felt guilty, but I couldn't stop. The moments with Éric had become my drug, my escape, and I was sinking deeper and deeper into this secret affair. Every day, I juggled between my family life and my clandestine meetings with Éric. My mind was constantly torn between guilt and euphoria, fear and excitement. I was living on the edge, aware that everything could collapse at any moment. But the thought of losing this newfound passion was unthinkable. That's how, without even realizing it, I started leaving traces of my infidelity, tiny but real clues of this double life. And that's how Paul, while randomly consulting Éric's medical files that I had carelessly left at home, discovered compromising personal notes. Sweet words, shared memories, mentioned appointments. Everything was there, revealing my betrayal. At that moment, my life turned upside down. I didn't know yet how much, but I felt that nothing would ever be the same. The day after Paul's discovery, I came home with a knot in my stomach. Paul was sitting in the living room, Éric's files spread out on the table in front of him. His eyes, usually so kind and loving, were now hard, icy. He didn't need to say a word, I knew he had figured it all out. The silence was deafening. "Julie," he finally said, his voice trembling with restrained anger, "what is this?" I stammered excuses, trying to downplay the importance of the notes. But Paul wasn't fooled. He had seen the love words, the hidden appointments, the exchanged confidences. He got up abruptly, leaving me alone with my guilt. I knew I had to make a choice, but at that moment, I couldn't think of anything but Éric. Our meetings became more frequent, more intense. Each moment with him was an escape from the reality of my marriage in crisis. Éric was my refuge, my rediscovered passion. We saw each other in discreet places, far from curious eyes. We shared moments of complicity, laughs, stolen caresses. He made me feel alive, desired, loved. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day at work, I went to Éric's place. He was waiting for me with a bottle of wine, a warm smile on his lips. We spent the evening talking about our dreams, our regrets, our shared past. He brought up high school memories, moments I had almost forgotten. His laughter, his way of looking at me, everything about him reminded me of the carefree, lively girl I had once been. That night, our relationship took a decisive turn. We crossed a line I knew I could never recross. Our bodies ignited in devouring passion, as if the years of absence had only strengthened our desire. Each kiss, each caress was a promise of happiness, an illusion of eternity. The next morning, waking up in Éric's arms, I felt a mix of happiness and terror. I knew what we were doing was wrong, that I was betraying Paul and my family. But the thought of giving up Éric, of returning to a life without passion, was unbearable. I convinced myself that I could manage this double life, that I could have the best of both worlds. The following weeks were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Every moment with Éric was an escape, a waking dream. But every return to reality, to my home, to Paul, was a descent into hell. Paul was distant, suspicious, and our arguments became more and more frequent. I knew he was suffering, but I couldn't help seeking refuge in Éric's arms. One afternoon, while we were having lunch in a small seaside restaurant, Éric took my hand and looked into my eyes. "Julie," he said softly, "what are we going to do? I can't keep living like this, in the shadows, hiding our love." His words resonated in me like a painful echo. I knew he was right, that this situation couldn't last forever. But the thought of abandoning everything, of facing the consequences, paralyzed me. I looked away, unable to respond. The following days were marked by growing tension. Éric became more insistent, demanding a decision. Paul, on the other hand, continued to dig, to search for clues, trying to understand. I felt trapped, like a tightrope walker on the brink of falling. Then came the day when Paul, in a fit of rage, decided to confront Éric in public. He had organized a dinner with our mutual friends, pretending to want to make amends and save face. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't imagine the extent of what was about to happen. The dinner took place in a chic restaurant in the Old Port. Paul had invited our closest friends, those who had known our couple for years. The atmosphere was tense from the start, but Paul played the game to perfection, displaying a facade of smiles. Éric, on the other hand, was nervous, sensing that something was up. The evening began normally, the conversations were lively, the laughs discreet. But I couldn't help but glance anxiously at Paul and Éric, fearing the moment when everything would fall apart. Paul raised his glass for a toast, drawing everyone's attention. He smiled, but his eyes were dark, burning with anger. "To my wonderful wife, Julie," he said, his voice dripping with irony, "and to our dear friends, thank you for being here tonight. I have an important announcement to make." My heart sank. I knew the moment of truth had arrived. Paul turned to Éric, his eyes piercing him. "Éric, you and I need to have a little chat," he said coldly. "I discovered something very interesting recently. Something I think everyone here should know." Murmurs of surprise and concern spread around the table. Éric turned pale, realizing that his secret was about to be revealed. Paul pulled out the compromising medical notes, brandishing them like irrefutable evidence of my betrayal. "Here's what I found in my dear wife's medical files," Paul announced, his voice cracking slightly. "Sweet words, hidden appointments. An affair that Julie has been having for months with Éric." A chilling silence fell. The looks turned to me, incredulous, shocked. I felt the tears welling up, but I refused to cry. I was petrified, unable to move or speak. Éric tried to explain, to downplay, but Paul wasn't listening. Paul's anger erupted into a violent argument, accusations and reproaches flying back and forth. Our friends, taken aback, didn't know how to react. Some tried to calm things down, but the situation was spiraling out of control. The naked, brutal truth was exposed before their eyes, and there was nowhere to hide. Paul's words were daggers, each revelation a deep wound. Éric eventually left the restaurant, unable to take any more. I was left facing Paul and our friends, devastated by shame and guilt. The evening ended in a heavy, oppressive atmosphere. Paul and I went home in silence, each lost in our thoughts. The following days were a nightmare. Paul avoided me as much as possible, refusing to talk or even look at me. Our children sensed the tension, asking questions I didn't know how to answer. My double life was collapsing, and I had no one to turn to. Éric sent me desperate messages, but I couldn't respond. I had to face the consequences of my actions alone. I took a few days off, unable to focus on my work. Every morning I woke up with a weight on my chest, an anxiety that never left me. The reality of what I had done hit me like a ton of bricks. I had betrayed Paul, destroyed our marriage, jeopardized my family. And for what? For a few moments of passion with an old love. One afternoon, as I walked along the beach to clear my thoughts, Paul appeared beside me. His face was marked by fatigue, sadness. He looked at me for a long time in silence, then spoke. "Julie," he said softly, "I want to understand. Why? Why, Éric? Why now?" His questions were legitimate, but I had no simple answer. How could I explain the inner void, the quest for passion, the need to feel alive? How could I make him understand that it wasn't his fault but a flaw in me that I had never been able to fill? We talked for a long time, exposing our pains, our regrets. It was a difficult but necessary conversation. I realized then that despite everything, Paul still loved me. He was willing to try to save our marriage on the condition that I cut all ties with Éric and that we go to couples therapy. It was a glimmer of hope in an ocean of despair. I agreed, knowing that the road would be long and arduous. Despite our agreement, the situation was far from resolved. Paul and I began couples therapy with a mix of hope and skepticism. Each session was a dive into our wounds, our unspoken issues, our accumulated frustrations. We had to relearn how to communicate, how to understand each other, how to forgive each other. Meanwhile, Éric continued to contact me, begging for an explanation, a chance to make amends. His despair resonated with me, but I knew that responding would only make things worse. I blocked his number, deleted his messages without reading them. It was painful but necessary to try to rebuild my life with Paul. The tension at home remained palpable. Paul and I made efforts to save face in front of our children, but each forced smile, each measured word was a trial. Lucas and Chloe weren't fooled. They felt the change, the coldness between their parents. Their sadness added to my guilt, constantly reminding me of the consequences of my actions. One evening, as I came home late from an especially exhausting therapy session, I found Paul sitting in the living room, a glass of whiskey in hand. He looked at me for a long time, then spoke in a tired voice. "Julie, I want to believe that we can overcome this. But I need time, proof that you are truly committed to saving our marriage." I understood his request, but it was terribly difficult to hear. Every day I fought against my own demons, against the desire to return to Éric. But I knew that if I really wanted to save my marriage, I had to devote myself entirely to this task. Months passed, and gradually the therapy began to bear fruit. Paul and I slowly regained a form of complicity, a fragile but present intimacy. We spoke more openly about our feelings, our fears, our hopes. Tender gestures, sincere smiles timidly returned. However, the shadow of Éric still hung over us. Every time I passed by his old neighborhood, every time I crossed places where we had met, a pang in my heart reminded me of what I had lost. But I held on for Paul, for our children, for myself. Then one day, a new ordeal arose. While reviewing the results of a routine medical test, I discovered I was pregnant. The news shook me to the core. Was it Paul's or Éric's? The question tormented me, but I knew I had to tell Paul. He deserved to know, and we had to decide together what to do next. I told him the news one evening after dinner. He remained silent for a long time, absorbing the information. Then, with infinite sadness in his eyes, he asked if the child could be Éric's. I couldn't lie. I explained that it was possible but that I couldn't be sure. The revelation was a crushing blow for Paul. He abruptly left the room without a word. I stayed there, alone, terrified by the implications of this news. Our already fragile marriage was in danger once again. The following days were hell. Paul avoided me completely, unable to face this reality. Our therapy sessions turned into painful confrontations, each word an additional wound. The question of the child became an insurmountable point of contention. Should we keep the baby despite the uncertainty of its paternity? Should we tell Éric? The questions piled up with no easy answers. I consulted my doctor for advice, trying to weigh the pros and cons. Every decision seemed to carry the potential to destroy everything I was trying to rebuild. The pressure was unbearable, and I felt on the brink of collapse. One evening, as I came home, I found Paul sitting in the children's room, looking at their baby photos. He looked up at me, his gaze filled with sadness and resignation. "Julie, I still love you," he said softly, "but I can't continue like this. This situation is too painful, too complicated. We need time, distance to understand what we really want." His words broke my heart, but I knew he was right. Our love, despite its strength, couldn't survive so many wounds without space to heal. We decided to separate temporarily, each seeking to find balance, to understand what the future held for us. The temporary separation from Paul was a shock but also a necessity. We needed distance to heal, to reflect on our future. During this time, I continued to work, to take care of our children, to try to find a semblance of normality in the chaos of my life. Paul's absence weighed heavily on me, but it also gave me time to refocus. I realized how much I had taken our relationship for granted, how much I had neglected the little things that made it special. Each day without him was a lesson in humility, a reminder of the mistakes I had made. On his side, Paul drew closer to his family and friends, seeking support and advice. Our exchanges were rare but always respectful. We knew we still had a long way to go, but hope remained. One afternoon, while I was seeing patients, Éric entered my office without an appointment. He looked tired, defeated. He sat across from me, his eyes filled with sadness. "Julie, I'm sorry for everything," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to complicate your life this much. I just wanted to regain what we had lost." His words touched me, but I knew our story was over. I needed to focus on my family, on myself. I explained gently that we had to move forward, each on our own. He nodded, understanding but pained. It was the end of an era, the beginning of a new one. A few weeks later, Paul and I decided to meet to discuss our situation. We chose a discreet cafe near the beach, a place where we had spent so many good moments in the past. The conversation was honest, painful, but necessary. We talked about our fears, our hopes, what we wanted for the future. Paul took my hand at one point, his eyes searching mine. "Julie, I don't know if we can rebuild everything, but I'm willing to try if you are too." His words were a balm on my wounded heart. I knew it wouldn't be easy, that we would have ups and downs, but I was willing to make the effort. We decided to resume our couples therapy, to continue working on ourselves, on our relationship. The pregnancy, meanwhile, remained a delicate subject. After many discussions and consultations, Paul and I decided to have a paternity test. The results revealed that Paul was the father. It was an immense relief, a glimmer of hope in the midst of so much uncertainty. We decided to keep the child and raise it together as a new chance for our family. Months passed, and gradually we regained some stability. Therapy helped us rebuild trust, rekindle our complicity. Our children, though aware of the difficulties, seemed more serene. We took each day as it came, one step at a time. One evening, as we sat on the terrace watching the sunset over the sea, Paul took me in his arms. For the first time in a long time, I felt we were on the path to healing. We had weathered a storm, but we were still standing, together. This experience had changed me. I had learned the importance of communication, honesty, commitment. I had understood that happiness doesn't lie in stolen moments of passion but in the depth of relationships built with love and respect. Paul and I still had a long way to go, but we were determined to do it together. Our marriage had been tested, but it emerged stronger, more resilient. I knew we could overcome any obstacle as long as we stayed united. And as I looked toward our future, I felt full of hope, ready to embrace each day with gratitude and love. We had survived infidelity, betrayal, but we had found the strength to forgive, to rebuild. And that was the greatest victory of all.